mentioned it. That even though I said that that was a topic that would enable me to introduce a whole bunch of folks, as I went through my canned spiel that you could tell I've used multiple times, nonetheless, I didn't emphasize a whole bunch of folks, as I basically said that was the point of it. I mean, I did emphasize Arnold Schwarzenegger and Conan the Barbarian. I hope that didn't totally ruin your night, but I could just imagine you waking up multiple times singing to yourself, kill your enemies, see them driven before you, and hear the lamentation of the women, etc. That's the chorus. But that's, by the way, reading an article about Saudi Arabia and what brought on Khashoggi's murder, which I'm sure you're all familiar, how he was basically snagged as soon as he entered the embassy in Turkey, and then basically sawed into pieces, apparently while he was still alive. And so the tape that everybody is talking about, did you listen to the tape? Well, I'm not going to listen to the tape. It's just a torture tape, it's just screaming, as he's being sawed into pieces. But
that's how the world works.
Well, that's the thing. If we grow up here, as we apparently do, I did too, although it was years ago. But even so, nobody got to saw anyone up in pieces. When I grew up, it was.
At least not that I remember.
Yeah, or new. I mean, we do have our tragic groups that decide to kill one of their friends and leave his body out in a frozen pond, and things of that sort. But generally speaking, we tend to avoid that kind of behavior. Apparently, the Khashoggi murder was just the most recent one. So I read the article, and apparently there's been a feud between various elements of the same family, which goes to show that having multiple wives and multiple children who have multiple wives and multiple children is not necessarily a good thing, because various parts of the family all try to take advantage of the family's owned property, etc. And so, and how do they handle it? The one occasion was that they called, the one part of the family called to China, where the one individual was flying to, and told the Chinese that he was a terrorist and he was arriving to arrange for the destruction of whatever. And so the Chinese, being very cautious people, as soon as his plane arrived, they had him disembark, took him, interrogated him, beat the crap out of him, and discovered in the interrogation and looking at his phone, the phone apparently was the main device that helped, could see that he was absolutely not connected in any way with any terrorism or anything of that sort. And they realized they'd been had by the other family in Saudi Arabia. They took it for granted that, that they were speaking truthfully. They realized they beat up the wrong guy. In fact, there might not have been any terrorists trying to do any of that sort of thing. Probably not, actually. They just wanted him to be, basically beaten up and sent back to Saudi Arabia so that they could have him and do what they wanted with him. But meanwhile, the other members of the family are trying to protect him, etc. So it's a feud between the two parts of the family. So finally, the MBS, who is the current crown prince, took all of the members of that family and locked them up in the Ritz Hotel.
House arrest.
And basically started beating them all up, and etc. And so, but what the lesson they learned, and this was like the heart of the article that I read, was the lesson they learned from trying to have this guy beat up by the Chinese was, don't get the Chinese involved. You know, set up your own team that will beat the crap out of the guy.
Yeah.
And kill him on the spot, right?
That's
So,
what they
so
learned.
that's what they learned. You know, no messing around. You know, saw him to pieces.
Yeah.
You know, give him to the gardener. You know, and that's the end of it. You know, and so the article basically was explaining how Khashoggi is just kind of one particular individual that was the end of that. But so this is Saudi Arabia, one of our allies, where we
Yeah.
get the oil from.
We sell military.
And we sell them billions of, and it creates trillions of jobs.
Yeah.
I believe our president said something to that effect, which would be amazing since we don't even have 1 trillion people.
Yeah.
If we had trillions of jobs, that would be a problem. We'd have to hire aliens or something. However, and I don't mean the kind that don't have cards. I mean, you know, the ones from outer space,
Yeah.
which I'm sure exist. After all, Area 51,
One.
obviously. Okay, so in talking about Conan the Barbarian, of course, I'm just saying this is the bad news. So much of the world is still like that. But when we look at the kinds of people in the conversation today, some of them are folks like Daniel Dennett. So today we've even got the day set to talk about Daniel Dennett. And the Brights. I don't know, have you ever heard of that? It's actually a online, I guess they even have meetings. But they're, I think, the opposites of the DDA. The DDA, you familiar with the DDA? Dum-Dums of America. I'll show you where I heard about Dum-Dums of America. I love this.
Oh, it's just wonderful having you on my show. I always wanted to get to know you and find out what you're really like.
Oh.
Yeah, because whenever I watch you on television, you always pretend to be so dumb. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm not pretending. I really am dumb. Yeah, I am. You know, and what's more, I'm proud of it. Dumb is beautiful.
I love that.
You're proud of being dumb?
That's right.
Hmm.
I mean, now, did you ever stop and think, who are all the people that cause all the trouble in the world?
I give up who?
The smart people.
Smart people.
That's right. And who are the scientists and the statesmen and the generals who run all the government, make all the wars, and the dumb people? No, the smart people. That's right.
You've seen Goldie Hawn before, yes?
Look at air pollution.
This is when she was young.
Wait a minute, the cars and the machines that cause all that.
They're smart
The
people.
smart people.
Yes.
Yes. And what's the major problem confronting our universities in the,
Smart people. See, I never thought of that.
That's because you're dumb like me.
She's so right. Yeah, that's right.
Yes, and then there's the overpopulation crisis.
Well, now you just wait a minute and hold on there, Goldie.
Mhm.
You can't blame that on the smart people. I mean, dumb people have just as many babies.
Yeah, but they can't count.
I know that. I know you, Goldie, but what can we dumb people do about this
Well,
thing?
now, this is the question we all have to stick together.
Yeah.
I said that before, didn't
Yeah.
I?
Oh, well, good.
Hey, we just formed a national organization.
Organization?
Yes.
Hey, why don't you cheer up?
It's called the DBA.
The DDA?
Dumb Dumbs of America.
Oh.
Yeah, it costs $5,000 to join, and we never have any meetings. You don't get membership.
No membership?
Membership privileges, you don't even get a membership card.
Well, gee whiz, a person would have to be real dumb to join an organization like that.
Exactly. That's how we weed out all the undesirables. I said that's how we weed out all the undesirables.
You said that just the same as you did the first time. That ain't being too dumb. Well, doesn't your organization have any activities at all?
Yes, we went and did
You went and pulled what?
a dumb march, a dumb people's march in Washington.
What happened?
Well, we got lost.
You got lost.
I was there for that one.
Is there any possible way that you can join the organization
Yeah, like that.
He didn't read the whole line,
like
I
that?
suppose.
It's not easy. You sit as an initiation test.
Oh.
And and you have to get under 30 to pass.
You have to have under 30 to pass. Well, what kind of...
So the DDA is the opposite of the Brights. Whatever the Brights. I thought, well, okay, I better look it up. Let's see. So a couple folks married, actually, decided to create it. So this is I don't know how to say that. Minga. I don't know how to say it. Retired educator, and Geisert. Somewhere it says Paul Geisert. So this is a married couple. They decided they're going to start their own organization, which is called the Brights. And somehow Daniel Dennett got invited to be part of this. So I'll play this. I don't know what's wrong with the volume on this one.
I read a draft of an article by Richard Dawkins about the Brights. That's where I learned about the term Bright. And I was at a conference of very intelligent high school kids from all over the country. And I had 20 minutes to talk about myself. And actually, as I was walking up to the podium to talk, I thought, all right, I'm going to do a little experiment. And so I said, I have something to say right at the outset. I'm a Bright. And I told them what it was. And the air was just electric. And after my talk, all these wonderful young kids came up to me, not all of them, but quite a number of them did, and they amazed me with what they said. They said, oh, we've never heard anybody say anything like that. We've never heard an adult in public say something, and to say it so matter-of-factly. And they were just thrilled. And that's what really convinced me that there are lots of young people out there with doubts, and they look around and they don't get any encouragement for thinking about those doubts. And I think we need to just throw open the windows and let some fresh air into their lives, and the Brights is a good way to do that. There's, I think, a huge reservoir of naturalistically thinking people who just haven't had a frame in which to think about their naturalism and the relationship between it and their religion. And I think that the Brights movement can provide a stepping stone for them, a way for them to ease out of some of the commitments that they no longer really accept, and begin to flourish as a naturalist. The main job that I think that the Brights do and should do is simply making the naturalistic worldview seem attractive as it is, and to give people a frame for how they're going to think about everything. Not just religion, how they're going to think about ESP and superstitions of all sorts, astrology. So it's just it's a way of disciplining your thought.
So that doesn't really help explain what the organization is. I'm not actually encouraging you to think about it, by the way. The reason I brought it up is because Daniel Dennett's frequently associated with the Brights. In fact, the whole group, including Richard Dawkins, I'll click on Richard Dawkins here. How many are familiar with Richard Dawkins at all? A couple. So he's a biologist. Daniel Dennett is a philosopher. He's a philosopher that's been working on the concept of consciousness. So that's like been his topic. Consciousness Explained was one of his early books, for example. And of course, he's changed his views as we've learned more about consciousness over his time. But in that sense, he's kind of a go-to guy to find out what's the current status of our understanding of consciousness, at least on one side. I think I've mentioned that there are multiple sides, of course, to consciousness. He's, I'm pretty sure, still a proponent of the idea that it's a macro issue, so that when you look at the brain and you look at all of the different components of the brain and how they interact with one another, consciousness is related to those interactions. I think it's similar to the image that you get from Douglas Hofstadter, who also works on that same topic, and he is the one who has the book out titled I'm a Strange Loop. Did I show you that picture? I am a strange loop. Because the neat thing about it is when you look at the picture itself, that picture on the cover, it's actually a fairly old book, because he was all thrilled. He used the hottest, newest technology of the day, and that was a VHS camera, to film his hand in front of a screen that was showing the image from the camera. And so it created a loop. So that's one image of his hand. As you could see, it created this kind of mirror, like a mirror effect. You know how, when you see a mirror and it reflects, etc. So somehow he did that with the camera. That's the cover picture of a book that basically says that's a really good image for understanding what the self is, and that is that it's kind of a series of processes that are self-monitoring, and so there's no real self. Not one of those is actually really you, but it's the whole process of those kind of self-reflecting moments where we're thinking, I'm doing this, I'm thinking that I'm doing this, I'm thinking that I'm thinking about I'm doing this. Whatever you want to do, however you want to look at it. It's not like there's an objective self. That's kind of been an old image, that has faded. And so instead we have kind of this process. And as far as he's concerned, Douglas Hofstadter, Daniel Dennett, Steven Pinker is another one. They all believe that it's a macro process. Let me show you Steven Pinker. Steven Pinker has really good hair, although it's really turning gray, you can see. But he's a Harvard psychology professor. By the way, it's really cool. He's married to a professor who's a philosophy professor, and she writes novels. And the funniest thing was one of the novels she wrote was about a Harvard psychology professor that had a debate with a philosopher about the nature of God. And of course her husband, Steve, had actually had such a debate with, so it was like this, this novel, I think it was titled The 24 Proofs of God or something, was basically a novel about her husband in that debate. And, it's kind of funny. So it's neat. And by the way, too, if you're into Jewish ancestry, both of them are Ashkenazi, which is like, wow, I'm jealous. Because they're so smart, they live so long, and they all look a lot alike, actually.
Well, there's a little bit of inbreeding, I think, the genetic. Not
Yeah,
inbreeding in the bad sense, but the genetic pool.
Yeah, it's a big enough pool, I guess, that it hasn't, it's been a good
It's
thing.
deteriorated.
Yeah, and the other are the Sephardic Jews, and they're not the only one. The Druze, who are not Jews, but they're also a relatively small group of people that have, for thousands of years, just married within, and so they have the same kind of. The Druze people are the ones that Syria has been most upset with. Well, in any case, that's just okay. But so he's also one of those that, in his arguments, believes it's a macro thing. The folks that believe it's a micro issue is Stuart Hemmeroff. And let's see if I can.
Hello and welcome to episode 3 of Unstoppable, the podcast. I'm your host, Mr. Kerwin Ryan, and in this episode, we're getting down and
hedonism, that comes under pleasure, but altruism, it feels better to give than to receive. The machines and the EEG don't exist, everything's together in some sense.
It's interesting when a lot of people talk about consciousness, especially from the science, and again from what your science, it's like looking at the brain and observing the brain and where it lives in the brain. But what is the heart's role in consciousness? Does the heart play a role?
Well, there was a great video, and I guess it is old enough that maybe it should be superseded by newer ones. However, it was great because he was in his scrubs, because Stuart Hemmeroff is a anesthesiologist, works and teaches at a hospital in Santa Fe, or he did. I don't know if he still is. Actually, I guess the right thing to do would be to go to the Wikipedia article on, get a basic image of him making it miserable. Oh, let's just close it. Okay, so anesthesiologist and professor at the University of Arizona, but Santa Fe, I believe, is where he's at. But in any case, he's put thousands of people under anesthesia for operations and stuff, and then, of course, brought them back out of it. And in doing that, he's also studying consciousness. And if you think about it, what's happening when you're being anesthetized is that you're not going to feel pain. What exactly is happening to you when you're anesthetized? Are you unconscious? Because you're not going to feel pain. The thing is, an awful lot of people, when they come around, reflect on all sorts of things happening while they're unconscious, right? So they're aware of something going on, and so of course this whole process, really got him interested in consciousness. And he and Roger Penrose, who's was a friend of Stephen Hawking before he died, of course, and he's a mathematician, but both of them are into quantum theory, and what he argues is that this is, at least partially, it might still, of course, be a macro process, but micro issues like quantum particles have characteristics that he thinks help explain consciousness. So that in the microtubules of the brain, we have quantum particles that go in and out of existence, and they're non-local, which means they connect with other particles through time and space, right? And by the way, all of us are made up of all these particles. Everything is. This is too, right? And I'm not suggesting that the brains of this lectern are interconnected with its particles throughout all time and space so that it remembers what was read off of this lectern 40 years ago. Actually, I'm sure there was nothing read off of it 40 years ago because it's so crappy. It's just a couple of years old and already broken. Sorry, but the thing is, all particles have these quantum characteristics. The thing is that our microtubules have these quarks basically that go in and out of existence, and the tubules myelin sheath is apparently just like a video cable sheath to try to keep the signal from leaking. So we obviously evolved this sheath in order to be able to concentrate, right? And by the way, you could even argue, and they do, the differences between different kinds of people, whether they're, say, psychotic, normal, or, weird, whatever the range would be, is like the strength of the myelin sheath, which keeps your focus more and more local. So if you have a psychotic relation, basically your myelin sheath is leaking. So you're getting signals from, the non-local universe that, of course, you're led to think are happening here and now. And they are for you, actually. Whereas the so-called normal people, we have roughly the same cable covering so that we're all able to focus within a certain range. By the way, we're clearly interconnected with the non-local universe to some extent, in the sense that you can tell what other people are thinking, that you remember things, what we think of stuff that happened yesterday, what happened today. Our memory is basically interconnected with time and space, so that we could literally argue that we remember things in the location in the universe where we had that experience, so that when we're remembering that, our minds are non-locally connected to those brain states that were ours in that part of the universe. So it's almost like our mind is kind of a map of where our experiences have occurred in the universe, right? And so that our mind literally goes to those places. I thought it was hilarious. I was reading an article the other day that the person was doing a study on how a certain event affected the brain. And they thought, well, what we ought to do before we try to figure out, what part of the brain is, influenced by this event, we should get a image of the brain before it has events. So let's get a resting state image of the brain, so we know, okay, so this is the brain that's resting and not thinking anything, and then we can compare it to an image of this event, right? And see what the difference is. Well, the problem they ended up with was when they started doing images of people in a resting state, where they said, okay, don't think about anything. Turns out we never don't think about anything. So there is no such thing. We're always thinking all the time. And by the way, if you saw that movie Lucy, that whole business that they used as the source of the movie to say that we're not using our 100% of our brain, that's bonkers. I don't know what. It hurts literally. As they tick as she goes up to 60% of her brain. And it's like, no, that doesn't work. We're using our brain all the time, etc. Are you using it well? That's a whole other issue, right? So what Stewart and his colleagues are, this is the micro argument, that while we might, of course, be using the whole brain, in various things, we're also doing stuff at the micro level that enables us to understand why we're quantum computers and not simply Turing-type machines. And for them, that's the specific difference in consciousness is what happens at the micro level.
Does he touch on the effects of psychedelics on the state of consciousness in the brain?
I think he does. For the most part, I know he does some scientific papers. He's never, as far as I know, written a book, although Roger Penrose has. Roger Penrose has really some nice little books on this.
It's interesting stuff. I was recently reading about ego death, and they referenced like psychotropic drug a lot in it.
Well, I mean, he does talk about how anesthesia, and there's different types of anesthesia. He's been working on that for like 20,000 patients or something. So, I mean, it's been years, and so he's gone through quite a lot of changes, I think, in trying to monitor, because you want to make sure that the person doesn't feel pain,
Yeah.
but at the same time, you don't want to kill the patient. You know, there's obviously a range of things. But so, what exactly are the drugs doing? Right? What, you know, it's not really under, you know, you like to think, oh, the scientists, the doctors, they know what they're doing. You know, you're going to put you under now, and we'll bring you out, you know, and you won't feel anything. Okay. Do you know what's actually happening to my brain while you do this? And they, no. That probably would be uncomfortable to find out. But he's an anesthesiologist, and he basically explains, you know, we don't really know. We've learned that this works, but we don't know why or what we're actually doing. Are you unconscious or you know, whatever?
Yeah.
So they don't really know. There's lots of stuff going on. But so this is Roger Penrose, and some of the books that he's got out on this topic. The Emperor's New Mind. Notice that's 89. Shadows of the Mind, 94. The Road to Reality is a complete guide to the laws of the universe. I have a copy. They're around. When I ordered that, I ordered it from Amazon, and the day it arrived, the postman actually put it in my front door, in between the screen door and the regular door. And when I went and I opened the door, it fell into my house. So it's one of those, you know, funk kind of books. But it's kind of interesting. But if you want kind of a summary of all of physics, that's a great book for that. And it's written at 3 different levels, so that it's easy, okay, and really hard. So that's kind of interesting. And it should be pretty cheap out there if you want your own copy, but check it out in the library too before you take the plunge, because you'll be adding quite a lot of weight to your home when you add that. But the cycles of time, road to reality, fashion. There's another, here it is. So the large, the small, and the human mind. That's a fairly small book, and it has a nice, easy to follow. I mean, even I could follow what he was describing about how consciousness works. And so he's on the micro side of that issue. So that's pretty interesting. Daniel Dennett, though, is on the other side. He's along with Steven Pinker and others. Not sure where Sam Harris is on that. Sam Harris is another. So let me do it this way: Harris, Daniel Dennett, and Richard Dawkins. And usually they throw in Christopher Hitchens, although Christopher Hitchens is dead now. Here's C.L.E. So here's the 4 Horsemen.
One of the things we've all met is the accusation that we are strident or arrogant or vitriolic or shrill. What do we think about that?
Yeah, well, I'm amused by it because I went out of my way in my book to address reasonable religious people, and I flew the draft with groups of students who were deeply religious. And indeed, the first draft incurred some real anguish. And so I made adjustments and made adjustments. And it didn't do any good in the end because I still got hammered for being rude and aggressive. And I came to realize that it's a no-win situation. It's the mug's game. The religions have contrived to make it impossible to disagree with them critically without being rude.
Without being rude.
They sort of play the hurt feelings card at every opportunity, and you're faced with the choice of, well, am I going to be rude, or am I going to articulate this criticism? I mean, am I going to articulate it, or am I just going to button my lip? And
He hasn't made
Right.
clear.
Well, that's what it is to trespass and
Daniel
taboo.
Dennett.
I think we're all encountering the fact that religion is held off the table of rational
Yeah.
criticism
So
in
that's
some
Sam
kind of
Harris.
formal way, even by, we're discovering, our fellow secularists and our fellow atheists. You know, just leave people to their own superstition,
His
even if
specialty
it's
is neuroscience.
abject and causing harm. I don't
We
go
also
too
think of
close with
philosophy.
that.
yeah, that was, of course, the point of
All
the
of them
title of
really
my
is
book,
philosophy.
is there is this spell, and we got to break it.
But if the charge of offensiveness in general is to be allowed
Christopher
in public
Hitchens.
discourse, then without self-pity, I think we should say that we too can be offended and insulted. I mean, I'm not just in disagreement when someone like Tariq Ramadan accepted now that the high tables of Oxford University, as a spokesman, says the most he'll demand when it comes to the stoning of women is a moratorium on it. I find that profoundly much more than annoying.
Right, yeah.
Insulting, not only insulting, but actually threatening.
But you're not offended. This is, you don't take any, I don't see you taking things personally. You're alarmed by the liabilities of certain ways of thinking, as in Ramadan's case.
But he would say, or people like him would say, that if I doubt the historicity of the Prophet Muhammad, I've injured them in their deepest feelings.
Right.
Well, I am, in fact, I think all people ought to be offended, at least in their deepest integrity, by, say, the religious proposition that without a supernatural celestial dictatorship, we wouldn't know right from wrong. That we only live by.
Are you really offended by
permission.
that? Doesn't it just seem wrong?
No, I say only, Sam, that if the offensiveness charge is to be allowed in general and arbitrated by the media, then I think we're entitled to claim that much without being self-pitying or representing ourselves as an oppressed minority, which I think is an opposite danger. I also that.
So this is. Notice that they referred to this as the Four Horsemen. They somehow came together and mutually supported one another, and often would show up in like panel discussions over things, often alone or in other groups, but often they came together, and so they kind of became the four that would go on these lecture shows to try to insult. It was the way it was interpreted, that despite however they want to frame it, they were virtually understood as insulting anyone that believed religion, of any sort. Their goal was to stop the kinds of things that precipitated in the 9/11 attacks in New York and Washington, D.C., right? The argument was if every kid grew up believing in science and thinking religion was absolutely ridiculous, the religious fundamentalist groups that recruited people that would then attack other people, etc., would have no recruits, because basically, if we make sure everyone grows up intelligent enough to realize that these things are absolute nonsense, and how do we do that? We make it like really ridiculous, so that kids will, so if an imam says believe in such and such, the kids will, what? Don't you realize how stupid that is? So basically laugh religions out of existence, and in that case, then hopefully we won't have religious wars anymore. We won't have suicide bombers. That kind of thing. So that was their goal. Obviously, they haven't met goal. I don't think. We still,
Yeah.
you know,
Long way.
especially since really, if you think about it, they weren't translated into Arabic, as far as I know. You know, all the places where they would lecture would basically be people that were already, you know, their audience, right? So they're preaching to the choir is our line for that. But then the counter to this was they were basically arguing that any religion, so even relatively sane people, by comparison, who were like Roman Catholic cardinals, you know, or you know, mainline church Unitarians, you know, in the United States, who, by the way, most of them would be atheists as well, right? But still talk about spiritual. By the way, Sam Harris does have a book. One of his books is on being spiritual. What the heck is the name of that one? Sam Harris. Spirituality? No, that's not the title of the book. Waking Up. Waking Up is his book. And actually, I think he has a podcast site where you can listen to him.
Is he a humanist, or like how does he find spirituality?
Well, he spent some time in India and studied Buddhism, and so I would say that I don't know that he calls himself a Buddhist, but he thinks of this kind of spirituality associated with Buddhism is what he's uses as his concept of spirituality. I've had friends that it's funny, they're members of, say, the Unitarian Fellowship, which I have attended for years here, and I think of it as a philosophy club, a local philosophy club. It has a building, you know, you have to pay dues, basically, you know.
I met one of your compatriots from there, actually, on my campaign.
There's quite a variety of folks that go there. A lot of interesting folks from town, especially politicians, Democrats mostly. In fact, I think all of the politicians that attend there are Democrats. But the attitude a lot of them have is that they don't believe in religion. They don't even so it's called a fellowship, and I think there's even an argument over it's still officially recognized as a church, a national church, with its headquarters in Boston, where it's been ever since the Revolutionary War, basically.
They get tax breaks too?
They do, but you know what? That really pisses them off, because they don't think churches should get tax breaks. So every year, the local fellowship goes and announces and gives a check paying our, you know, since we don't get taxed, we give them instead kind of a donation back, you know, what we figure the taxes ought to have been, and we think all the churches in town should do the same thing. Fat chance. It's actually, I thought, quite embarrassing because it's so little, you know, because our fellowship is so small. It usually works out to be like 1,000 something, you know, which is less than what I pay on my own house, you know. So, you know, that's like, you know, that's pretty embarrassing. And I'm going to stand. The one year I actually had to go with the minister and stand there because I was the president of the fellowship that year, and stand there. Here's our check for, you know. And I'm like, geez, this is embarrassing. Yeah. But I had to do it. It was my job. But they are adamant, a lot of them, that they don't believe in religion. They don't think of that as a religion. You know, my question last class about, you know, do you think atheism defined as a religion by me actually is a silly to them, because of course all four of those folks would feel like there's no way it's right to call them believers in a religion, right? And yet, you know, I actually saw Richard Dawkins, I think I mentioned, he gave the presentation at Fairbanks. I took Donna. Remember, she smacked me because, that she didn't realize what I was taking her to. I was, like basically a religious service for atheists, and so she was horrified. She couldn't leave. She was stuck because I was the transportation. In fact, she wouldn't. My wife is one of those women that doesn't know where the heck they are. So even if she left the auditorium, she wouldn't have been able to find the car, the Winnebago we brought. Where the parking lot was. That kind of thing. We've lived in Anchorage since '87, and she would get lost trying to get downtown. She has no, and we only have one road.
Yeah.
So.
Only 1 hour.
But that's her forte, mine, different. In any case, so the fellowship, for the most part, feel like it's not a religion. They don't believe in religion. They don't want to be associated with religion. They feel that's insulting to their intelligence. On the other hand, a lot of them feel like they're spiritual. But they want to think of spiritual as different than being religious. Because to them, spiritual means you're aware of kind of the emotional empathy that we ought to have for other people, for the power of our spirit in motivating us, and not only in the sports kind of thing, where team spirit is an important thing if you want to win. It really is. I mean, if the team is all like, maybe, they're not going to win anything. But if they have loads of team spirit to the point where they'll sacrifice themselves by jumping and crashing onto the hardwood floor and whatever it is that they do, they're the ones that win, obviously. So so in that sense, kind of a cohesiveness it's created by really vocabulary and body language is what is going to make or break a successful team. But see, you can have a spiritual guide without religion. So
Sam's kind of ticked off the left, though, last I heard.
Oh, well, he's a fan of Charles Murray. And Charles Murray is very conservative. By the way, I'm a fan of Charles Murray because I think if you... Charles Murray, clearly another... So... Okay, we'll go this way. So, first major book that had quite an impact, I think, was Losing Ground. That was actually a study paid for by the government. He's a social scientist, so his job was basically to study the impact of the LBJ welfare programs, etc., the Great Society programs, the LBJ, JFK, and Lyndon Baines Johnson. You guys all know who LBJ, if I say LBJ, sorry. I was born under Truman, so I don't know if that makes sense, not under Truman, but, Truman was president when I was born. And so Ike, arrived after that. I dated myself, but yeah, I was born in 51, so. Is that old? I don't know.
Did Truman
Previous
do 2
century.
terms?
Pardon?
Did Truman do 2 terms?
I believe so. Well, actually, since he seceded,
Yeah, he came in.
Roosevelt died shortly after being elected for his 4th time. But so Truman finished out that and then was reelected. did not continue after that. So I think, officially he might have been eligible to, but he did not. In any case, so Losing Ground was a very serious analytic study of the status of American people of all races during the implementation of those welfare programs. And the main conclusion of the book, and you'd have to read the book to see how detailed that was that people prior to the institution of those welfare programs were actually gaining more than they did after those programs started. So actually there was a decline in increase in their status after those programs. And so then the theoretical explanation for that would be that people working on their own tend to improve themselves by learning and working hard in order to reap the rewards of working hard. But if the government is giving you money, that actually encourages just the opposite behavior, so that by instituting social welfare programs, checks from the government, people began thinking of themselves as deserving of this money, and so a culture of dependency began. Yes?
Now, I would say, you said the government paid him to make this analysis, right?
They didn't.
Which administration would be my question.
It came out in '84.
Okay.
So was that
Reagan?
Nixon?
No.
Wait. I'm sorry. Nixon was 70-something. Carter.
When was Reagan elected?
Yeah, it would be Reagan. I'm pretty sure. Yeah. But it wasn't like Reagan said, "Hey, make the book show this." No. And in fact, as you read the book, I know you can make statistics support any kind of theory, but all along, I think his books have reflected I know the social sciences are soft sciences and heavily influenced by their theoretical interpretation and the goal of the research, but I think he's really avoided a lot of that, so that I think the government believed the results of this, and it was after that that the government basically said, okay, we've got to get out of the welfare business because we're only making things worse. Welfare is important, but it shouldn't come from the government, because if you're getting it from the government, it's considered a right, and that they owe me this. Whereas if I'm lending you money, you feel obligated to me, and you want to do something to pay me back. But when people get something from the government, they don't feel an obligation to pay the government back. So they don't feel like there's an obligation to get themselves out of the situation they're in, right? So the overall problem really is the sense of entitlement that comes from these government programs that kind of create this culture of dependence that makes things worse. Because then kids grow into a family where the way you survive is by basically becoming a needy family that gets all the benefits of the programs that are available, instead of getting the education, getting the, understanding that life is not easy. It's tough. Getting working every day, day by day, earning enough money that you build up some capital maybe, so that you can kind of have a retire, all that stuff. And by the way, Social Security is into that, pool of problems too. Remember, Social Security started in the Roosevelt, Delano Franklin Delano Roosevelt period, right? That was, who knows the one who came up with the idea, and, well, actually we could trace it back to Prussia, I know, right? So Bismarck, Otto Bismarck, was the first one that instituted social.
He's not a very big socialist either, which is
No, it was because he figured it would improve the overall health of the population, which would then help strengthen the army.
yeah, that's all.
So, but yeah, there was actually a woman in Roosevelt's staff that really is the one that kind of pushed that, and she's famous for that. Okay, but so Losing Ground, that was a really important book, and it actually changed government policy. But then the next book is what really created controversy, and that was The Bell Curve. I'll click on that.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
Business of being long.
Now, I've actually read the book more than once, because I keep going back to the sections where, there was actually only one chapter that talked about race. And there's a paragraph in that chapter where he says, if you're interpreting our results as a race, connecting race to intelligence, you're misreading the book. And voila is French for so there. That's precisely how most people, which number one tells me they didn't read the book. They jumped on the bandwagon, and in fact, I know people that I've said that he's not a racist. This isn't a book that makes that connection. And by the way, the subsequent books that he's written do not either. And yet, people are absolutely adamant in their mind, even though they're fellow Harvard grads. He's a Harvard person, that he's a racist, and but Sam Harris, in a wonderful interview that he did on his podcast with Charles Murray, explains in the podcast, I was with everyone else. I thought that this was a book that, made all these claims that intelligence is associated with race. And then I actually read the book in preparation for this interview, and I'm amazed. It doesn't say, it's totally, So, if you're going to criticize the book, actually you should read the book and see what it's about. And it's a great survey of the history of intelligence tests and testing and so on. Explains all that, explains what Q or N is, etc. And then the statistics are bad in some respects, because an important part of what enables people to do well on an intelligence test is their experience, their education. And guess what? If you were raised in a poor environment with very little intellectual stimulation, guess what? It's going to look like you and your family and your peer group are not very brilliant. But it's clear, it's clearly associated with a particular environment, right? But of course, different groups of people end up being attached to certain environments. So when you look at the statistics, it certainly looks like people in certain groups in the United States do not compete very well. Well, but that's what the statistics show. It doesn't mean that there's a racial connection, a genetic connection between that. It's certainly a historical one, right?
Probably more of a class thing, I imagine.
Well, that's actually why I've in describing my own feelings, because I've never been what I think of as a racist. For one thing, I didn't grow up in a neighborhood where there were other races. It was all Caucasian. If there was anything, it was like, oh, they're Italian. You know, they're Irish. You know, there's, you know,
That's a northern thing.
you know that kind of, you know, thing. You know, mostly it was we're Catholics and they're Protestants. You know, that was, you know, in fact, I remember growing up and being confused because there was a Catholic school and there was a public school, and so we actually thought, well, those are publics. I didn't, you know, that's not a thing, you know, but, you know, didn't really know what the difference was. But so it wasn't really till I joined the Army where races became kind of like, wow, you know, because now I'm with mixed folks. But I've met them as people, you know, I didn't meet them as, whoa, you know, this is a totally different kind of, and a big part of that, of course, is the Army teaches everybody to be green. You know, you're one green Army family, you know, not you know, different races in the Army. And actually an awful lot of my awareness of race as an issue happened after that. But I definitely think of myself as a classist. I like people that like the things that I like, no matter what color they are. But that strikes me as, if you look at evolution and the way animals behave, that's the way animals behave. They like animals that are similar to them, you know, as long as they're not competitive over stuff, you know. But this is a fascinating book. I really recommend reading it, and especially since it's still today a big issue. And in fact, if we go and look at
Is he still alive?
oh yeah.
No.
So this was 2 years ago, I think, at Middlebury.
Hydrogen. A bit like emoticons on the internet, it's everywhere. When pure hydrogen bonds with oxygen from the air, so cute, it releases electricity to power cars, trucks, and even trains. Now that's how to make the future.
John Stuart Mill claimed that when there are persons to be found who form an exception to the apparent unanimity of the world on any subject, even if the world is right, it is always probable that dissensions have something worth hearing to say for themselves, and that the truth would lose something by their silence.
So that's the student speaker who's introducing Charles Murray. But
I'm here today with a hope that we can live up to our values. And I would like you all to remember the calls that were made by many on this campus, both past and present, for honest, inclusive, yet rigorous debate and discussion. Well, I invite you today to express your opinions. These are truths! And invite you to welcome with me this evening's speaker, Dr. Charles Murray.
I don't think they like him very much.
Yeah. I really should. It's not like I was a big dude then.
The real anticlimax. I have thought.
Oh my god.
so they all got up and just refused to. So this was in the news, right? Because this was, I believe, the first situation of something that's kind of precipitated into a, I don't know how frequent it is, but
You hear about it a lot on YouTube. I don't know if it's as often as the right makes it seem it is, but it's definitely silly.
but you can look up what happened and everything. And Sam Harris, in the discussion with Charles Murray, this is after what happened there, talks about that. But so why are they all protesting him? Because they're absolutely convinced that, without having read the book, I can guarantee, because they wouldn't have that opinion if they actually read the book, that he's a racist and that we shouldn't even listen to this. It hurts us just listening to this guy, right? He's damaging us. We're so insulted by just the vocabulary this guy uses. The crowd doesn't want these people even having a chance to speak, right? So of course that's precipitated into this whole question of free speech, et cetera. And why? Because the interpretation of the bell curve, really. So that's kind of.
Glad I haven't seen that too much in this school. I was actually kind of worried about that.
Yeah, well, number one, I don't think we've had any speakers up here that would arouse that kind of response. I guess the closest experience I had to that kind of thing was one of George Bush's. He was the Attorney General, I think, for George Bush. Or assistant or something, but he was here, and he was one of the things that came up was the waterboarding issue of the detainees in in Cuba, and he pointed out, Marines call it training. That Marines, actually get waterboarding as a training technique. I don't think everybody does, but I guess certain individuals knowing what it's like.
The recon guys.
The recon guys. And so and I was actually sitting next to a student who was the kind of student that wanted to get upset, and he did, but he was by himself, and so there was no stir or anything. In fact, I listened to the response to his question, and I thought that was a good response.
I think that demographic is smaller than a lot of people trying to make it seem to be the super crazy left.
Yeah.
They're definitely out there, but they're not.
The Antifa.
Yeah, I don't think that's the majority.
Yeah, but if you listen to the crowd in that situation, they're dumb.
Yeah.
They were dumb people, that were upset and given voice to vent their upsettedness.
There may not be many of them, but they're certainly the loudest. They're definitely loud.
But
same thing with the right. Like the whole right. They're super.
Well, I know Berkeley. The Berkeley campus has had these issues. Middlebury, of course, that was a surprise because that's where this happened with Charles Murray, and I think of myself as I've only went to Middlebury one summer for 9 weeks, but still I was there. That's I took a course. The Army paid for it. Thank you. But nonetheless, I was there for 9 weeks. One hot, miserable summer, which the only thing I had to do in the afternoons to keep myself relaxed was go out and play golf every day, on the golf course there on campus. Pardon? Vermont. Middlebury. Yeah. It was hot.
I don't know. It gets hot in Vermont.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, I wore shorts and went out. The one problem we had golfing there that summer was that we were only allowed to speak Russian. And so we had to come up with all of our terms for мяч, well, that's ball, but what do you call par, et cetera, so, we had to, because we had our badges that said we're only allowed to speak Russian. Because that was part of that
immersion.
The immersion thing. Well, I didn't really talk that much about Daniel Dennett. I really should have.
I started talking about Murray.
Well, you know, they're all in this conversation, which I just love. I love reading all this stuff. Murray, by the way, has had lots of continuing books. He's still a very influential author. Daniel Dennett has also, I mean, if you look at his continuing books, so this looks like it's going in sequence here. So yeah, so his last one is From Bacteria to Bach and Back, The Evolution of Minds. Inside Jokes is, I actually use that in my logic class when I talk about fallacies, because there's a connection with our fallacies are also used, the same kinds of fallacious reasoning are used for our jokes. So it's kind of interesting to make that connection. Caught in the Pulpit, Leaving Belief Behind. That's an interesting book where he talks about different people who were either priests or ministers of religions who've had problems because their minds have changed, but they're variously connected. It's their career. So if they change their minds and then no longer believe in the church that they're that they're a minister in, they're basically out of their housing allowance, their housing, their income. Their families stuck, without support. It'd be pretty late in your life to suddenly try to get into a completely different kind of job, as an minister of, say, a Methodist church or something, right? So as individuals, they like to have an opportunity to talk to someone about the problems they have themselves, reconciling how they have to continue being the minister of a church, professing a particular set of beliefs when they've lost their beliefs themselves, right? So that's kind of an interesting thing. There's a variety then of how people react to this. Some people do leave. Other people stay. Other people stay and want to change the church so that everyone else comes along with them. That usually doesn't work very well. It's probably one of the reasons why a lot of the mainline churches have lost membership over the years. It's interesting, the more educated members are the ones that have gone away from the churches, and the churches that have been growing are the more fundamentalist ones. So that's kind of interesting. But that's the point of that book there, where he interviews and talks with different ministers, and a few priests even. Science and Religion, Neuroscience and Philosophy. So you can see his focus is on consciousness, but at the same time, when this happened, he joined with Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, and Christopher Hitchens, who died a few years ago, cancer of the throat. He was a heavy smoker and drank a lot. He was drinking at that, they were all drinking at that table. I don't know if you noticed.
2 beers and 2 martinis.
Yeah.
You noticed.
I noticed.
But in any case, hopefully these are all interesting folks. Christopher Hitchens, by the way, his writings are absolutely fantastic. They're mostly short essays because he wrote for like Vanity Fair. He's got a couple books out. One, my favorite was Hitch 22, which a lot of people called him Hitch, Christopher Hitchens, right? So Hitch, but Hitch 22 is a play on Catch 22. If you're familiar with that book and movie, and it was his biography, at least up till his adulthood, and quite fascinating because it talked about the real Hogwarts that real British young men would go to, and not the same as Hogwarts, not the same kind of relationships. And basically, by the way, explains why his hostility to religion is so off the wall, actually. So I needed a good quiz question. I never think of that until it's like awfully late. But we should have a good quiz question. I suppose one of the, I'll mention this, that 2 days ago, yesterday, in the Daily News, Michael Carey, who, I don't know if you know Michael Carey or not. Michael Carey used to be the editor of the Daily News, or at least the opinion page many years ago. He's been retired for a long time. I still see him walking around downtown. He goes to the fellowship, and every once in a while he throws in a very nicely written article in the paper that they'll publish for him. And the other day it was an article about the results of our election and how red a state we are and so on. But in the article, one of the things he mentioned was, well, there's just not enough highly educated people in the various sections of our community for us to have Democrats win, basically. And I thought, that's rude. That is rude to make the association between highly educated folks and Democrats. Because I know an awful lot of people who are highly educated who are not Democrats. There's highly educated people on both sides. So how should I phrase this? Would this be a good question? In your opinion, do you think the more highly educated a person, that it would lead them to one or the other political side?
Well, I like that, yeah.
Is that a good question?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I mean, it's a real question, because in many respects there does seem to be a relationship between how many years of college you've got and which side, Democrat or Republican, you are. On the other hand, we've got some folks that are very well educated that are Republicans, so it doesn't seem like that really. There's I think the possibility that you can have some highly educated people that are not that well educated that pick the wrong side, perhaps. I haven't seen this out yet, but Victor Hansen and son, I don't know, what's defense of Trump, actually. The case for Trump. So I don't know if this is out yet.
No? Pre-order?
Pre-order only. But Victor Hansen, I don't know if you've seen him on TV. There's other books that he's written. He's brilliant. So here's an example of a highly educated person that obviously is, well, that doesn't mean he's a Republican, actually. But
is he in support of Trump?
He's
making a
yes.
case for Trump? Okay.
No, I believe, from what I've heard from him on TV already, is that a lot of people in the White House are trying to frustrate Trump's attempts to do what he was elected to do. That's true. I mean, if you think of the fifth risk and fear, so there's a couple books out that talk precisely about that, how people in his staff literally will make sure that he never gets to see something, because if he signs it, it will be bad. In their opinion, right? And yet it's the thing that Trump keeps asking for. Where's the thing on such and such? It's in a file. No, I want to see it tomorrow, but they'll distract him with something. So there's these folks that are deliberately keeping things from happening, which were part of his program. So I suppose you could describe that and not actually be supporting Trump, but just saying, hey, this is our democracy. He was elected to put this program into
Most people weren't elected and not held.
and all these people that were, they're part of the swamp, right? They're trying to keep Trump from being successful in doing what he was elected to do, and so, there's that. But I haven't read this obviously yet, but just listening to Victor Hansen, I would say, gosh, he's brilliant. There's a couple professors at Princeton that I think that are absolutely brilliant, that irritate the heck out of some liberal friends I have, So that's fun. But by the way, I love thinking of myself as neutral. For one thing, I was in the Army, and the Army taught me never to take sides, at least officially, and you learn not to, because, of course, it's against the rules for you to make any connection in people's minds with the military and a political point of view, because, of course, we want to make sure that the Army's not part, they're not a third world country where the Army, if you don't behave yourself, the Army might, throw out the president and put a general in their place, We've had some interesting fictional stories about that. 7 Days in May is one book I remember. It became a movie too, but